Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? On the day that was supposed to be the most important and meaningful moment of my life, the one I had spent months carefully planning, the one I thought would finally be about me and the love I had found, my own family decided that my vows weren't worth their time, and they chose to celebrate my sister instead. You might think I'm exaggerating, that there must be more to the story, but I promise you I'm telling it exactly as it happened, and it still makes my stomach turn when I remember how casually they walked out of that room like it was no big deal. I grew up in a house where my sister, Megan, was always the star, the one who got the applause, the one who got rescued from every bad decision, the one who could throw a tantrum and somehow end up being praised for her passion. I was the steady one, the quiet one, the one who was expected to be mature, even when I was a kid. If Megan ruined a birthday cake, I was told to share mine with her. If Megan flunked a test, I was told not to brag when I got an A. It was always her spotlight, and my role was to smile in the background. I thought that maybe, just maybe, on my wedding day things would finally be different, because what parent would ruin their child's vows? Apparently mine would. The ceremony itself went fine, beautiful, emotional, everything I could have hoped for. But it was the reception where it all came crashing down. Just when we were about to cut the cake, Megan stood up, tapped her glass with a spoon, and announced, before dessert, "I just want to share something exciting." She pulled out a pastel-colored card and waved it in the air. It was a baby shower invitation. She declared to the entire room that she was pregnant, that her shower would be the event of the season, and the crowd actually cheered. My parents clapped like she had just been handed an Olympic gold medal. I stood there, frozen, watching my guests shift their attention from me in my gown to Megan and her announcement. And before I could even process what was happening, my parents left the reception hall with her, saying they had to get set up with some of Megan's friends who were apparently waiting nearby. My vows were scheduled to be read in less than 10 minutes, and my parents were gone. They didn't even glance at me, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't care that they were leaving in the middle of my wedding reception. I wish I could tell you I confronted them right then, but I didn't. I swallowed it, forced myself to smile, and let the reception continue because I wasn't going to let them completely ruin the day Adam and I had worked so hard to create. But Adam, God bless him, did something that made me realize I didn't have to just accept it. While everyone was distracted with Megan's little show, he quietly slid a set of papers across the table to the venue manager. By the next morning, every single expense my parents had contributed to the wedding was refunded back to their account. The bar tab, the flowers, even the gratuities, they were removed from my parents' name and put on ours. That way they could never say, "We paid for this, so we get to act however we want." From that point forward, they had no stake, no leverage, no excuse. That night, after Adam and I got home, I opened my laptop and created a folder called Do-Over Energy. It was my private place to save every single detail, every piece of proof, every text, every timestamp, and every photo that showed exactly what had happened. And the very first thing I put in there was the clip from a friend's video, where you can hear my dad's voice saying, "We'll be quick," followed by the sound of the doors closing right as the DJ called us up for the vows. It is such a small, mundane sound, but it cut through me like a knife. The next morning, I sent out a thank you email to every guest who had stayed until the very end. I attached a curated set of photos, smiles, dancing, laughter, the vows, the cake cutting, and I left out anything to do with Megan's announcement. No baby shower cards, no pastel balloons, no proud parents clapping for her. The subject line was simple: "Thank you to everyone who stayed for our vows." I didn't have to explain what that meant. Everyone who had been there knew exactly who stayed and who didn't. A few hours later, my mom replied. She wrote, "You're being dramatic. We just stepped out for a moment, and it wasn't about you." I didn't argue. I just hit reply and typed 5 words. "I have the footage, Mom." That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the quiet, forgiving one. If they wanted to rewrite what happened, I was going to make sure I had every piece of evidence lined up so they couldn't. And, trust me, That little folder called Do-Over Energy would become the one thing that made all the difference when they came crawling back later, begging me for another wedding they didn't deserve. Because here's the thing, what I thought ended that night was actually just the beginning. And I had no idea how quickly the stakes were about to rise. I used to believe that if you kept your voice calm and your facts straight, then people who cared about you would meet you there, because clarity is disarming and fairness is contagious. Yet a week after the wedding, when I should have been coming down from the high of clean vows and small joys, I opened my phone and saw my parents' smiling faces under a caption about a perfect day for family where everyone felt celebrated. And there in the comments, Megan had dropped a trail of hearts and a line about the future being bright, and in that moment it hit me that they were not only comfortable with what happened, they were already repackaging it, as if my reception were a soft runway for her announcement and my vows were just background noise. Which meant the truth would not survive without help, and I was going to be the one to give it oxygen. So I invited them to coffee. Not a trap and not a fight, just a table by the wall and a straightforward ask for a clean conversation, and they arrived with that breezy tone my mother uses when she wants me to be the reasonable one, telling me we should move past small misunderstandings because family moments are messy and everyone is juggling feelings. And before the foam on my latte had even settled, my father started into a speech about how Megan did not plan the timing and people were simply excited, and that is when I reached into my bag, opened my laptop, and pressed play on a crisp clip a friend had sent. A simple piece of audio where you can hear the DJ announce that we are about to begin the vows, and right on top of that you hear my father's voice say that they will be quick, and then the unmistakable sound of the double doors closing. And I kept my face neutral because I did not want a performance. I wanted them to hear themselves, and when the clip ended I did not lecture or raise my voice. I just said that this is what happened, and I will not pretend otherwise. There was a pause that told me they were recalculating, and then my mother said she hated that it looked like that because the intention was not to hurt me, which is the sentence people use when they want to be absolved by motive instead of action. And I nodded and said intentions do not walk out on vows, people do, and since none of us are deleting the past, we have exactly one lever left, which is accuracy, meaning if they post about my wedding going forward, they will include what actually occurred, or they will post nothing at all. And because I know how fast stories spin when left to the wind, I had already built a tiny website album the night before. 1 page, no commentary. Just a simple timeline with timestamps and a handful of photos in order. And I slid the link across the table and told them that if they wanted to share anything they could link to this, because it is tidy and unarguable and will save us from more misunderstandings. My father tried the softness route, saying that public links felt dramatic, which was funny given that a public walkout is pretty dramatic, and I held the line without heat, saying that this is not revenge, it is record-keeping. And if they prefer to post nothing, that is absolutely fine, but if they post, it will be accurate, and we sat in the hum of the cafe while they weighed whether accuracy cost them more than the comfort of their version. And when it was clear I would not bend, my mother changed the subject to grandchildren because that is her favorite detour, which only reminded me why they were able to leave me mid-vow in the first place, because in their heads a potential baby has always outranked my current life. When I left that table, I felt steady rather than triumphant, and at home I opened the Do-Over Energy folder and added the audio clip, the calendar invite for the vows with the exact time, and a short note to myself that I would never again try to prove pain with adjectives when I could do it with receipts. And as a small act of housekeeping, I sent a short email to the church coordinator and the extended family list that had been CC'd on my mother's recap, with language that was calm and surgically plain, saying that if anyone planned to share photos or write about the wedding, they could use this album link to ensure the timeline is correct, because we are trying to keep everything clean and simple. And then I closed my laptop and chose to enjoy a quiet evening with Adam, because I refused to donate every hour of my newly married life to other people's denial. Of course, Megan could not leave it alone, and later that night she sent me a block of text about how I was competing with her baby, and how my refusal to be joyful for her was toxic, and how our family would be happier once I stopped making everything a scoreboard. Which was almost funny because she had announced a literal event inside my event while my parents escorted her out of my vows, and I did not argue or craft a counterpoint. I simply forwarded her message to the folder because when people beg to be quoted, I have learned to honor the request. And for a full month, I let the dust settle and answered only logistical questions about our tiny church blessing that Adam and I had planned as a simple way to share a short vow moment with local friends who could not make the reception. And for a brief stretch, I thought maybe the worst of it had passed. Then the invitation appeared, pastel and chirpy, a baby shower announcement from Megan with an RSVP link and a banner that read "Save the date," and the date, as if chosen by an algorithm designed to offend, sat squarely on the same afternoon as our church blessing, down to the same hour, which would have been unbelievable if I had not lived with these people my entire life. And within minutes, I watched the little green check marks pop up as my parents clicked going on her event while completely ignoring our blessing invite, and since I enjoy clarity more than drama, I did not plead or call or bargain. I sent one last group message to the family list with the album link and the blessing details and a polite note that we understood everyone has commitments and that we would love to see whoever chose to be there. And I pressed send knowing that the next move would not be a speech or a cry. It would be something quieter and sharper, the kind of move that does not need to be announced. Because time will do the announcing for you, and as I set my phone face down and looked at Adam across the table, I realized we had crossed a line I should have drawn years ago. Which is the line where I stop begging for people to see me and start making choices that make it impossible for them to unsee what they did. When my godfather, Raymond Cole, passed away, the grief that settled over me was heavier than I had anticipated, not just because he had been one of the few adults in my life who genuinely treated me as if my words carried weight, but because losing him meant losing the quiet reassurance that there was at least one person in the family sphere who didn't see me as second place to my sister. In the middle of funeral arrangements, condolences, and the painful process of sorting through memories, I received an email from his attorney's office, and within it lay a document that would shift the balance of power in ways none of us could have predicted. Uncle Ray, as I had always called him, had left me the bulk of his estate in the form of a trust, and not just any trust, but one that came with clear, practical conditions that he knew I would respect because I was the only one he trusted to read the fine print and actually follow it. I sat at the dining table that night with Adam, scrolling through the legal language, half in disbelief, half in quiet recognition that Ray had seen something in me all along. The money was not infinite, but it was substantial, enough to free me from certain career compromises, enough to fund long-term projects, enough to turn heads in a family where dollar signs had always translated to power. And sure enough, it did not take long before word leaked out, whether through a slip at the lawyer's office or a relative who heard whispers I cannot say, but within hours of the news reaching my parents, my phone lit up with call after call. The tone of their voices had shifted so abruptly that if I had not known them my whole life, I might have thought I was speaking to different people. My mother's tone was syrupy sweet, coated in concern about how I was holding up, while my father suddenly seemed to discover the importance of family healing and togetherness. They spoke of regret without saying the word sorry. They spoke of love without acknowledging their absence from my vows, and they wrapped it all up with a new idea that had clearly been rehearsed between them. A do-over wedding, full ceremony, big crowd, professional video, family speeches. The whole stage production. They framed it as a chance to rewrite the narrative, to repair the image, to present unity to the world, and if I had not already trained myself to listen for what was not being said, I might have been touched. But what they meant was simple. They had seen the headlines in their heads, the kind that linked a family to money, the kind that made them look important by association. And they were desperate to hitch their wagon to the fortune they had once dismissed as irrelevant because it came attached to me. Their sudden interest in a new wedding had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what I now represented. Instead of hanging up or yelling, I chose a different tactic. I kept the call short, calm, and professional, just as I had at the cafe weeks earlier. I asked them to send their thoughts by email so I could review them properly, which served two purposes at once. It gave me written evidence of their intentions, and it denied them the performance of live persuasion. Sure enough, within hours an email arrived in my inbox full of glowing sentences about new beginnings, a chance to celebrate the right way, and bringing joy back to the family, but nowhere in the entire message did they acknowledge walking out of my vows, skipping my church blessing, or framing Megan's announcement as the centerpiece of my reception. The omission said more than the words, and I filed it all neatly into the do-over energy folder, labeling it post-Ray apology-free pitch. Later that night, Adam and I sat across from each other and drafted a list, not of demands, but of categories. One column was titled Repair, where we wrote down what it would take for us to genuinely feel respected again, and the other was Protection, where we listed measures that would prevent them from using me as a stage prop in the future. In the Repair column sat the obvious, an actual apology, not whispered in private, but visible in the same public spaces where they had shared their false narrative. In the Protection column sat things like boundaries on who could speak at a ceremony, who handled photos, and who controlled money. The exercise itself made it clear, if they were not willing to confront the truth, then no amount of flowers, cameras, or speeches would fix what had been broken. I took a day to think, and then I responded to their email with a single, clean line, happy to discuss a do-over, but before we plan anything I need written apologies for leaving my vows, posted where the original recap was shared. I did not expand or soften. I wanted the message to sit there unadorned, unshakable. Hours later, my mother replied with a proposal. They would apologize, but only at the do-over, on camera, as part of the event. In other words, they were willing to acknowledge wrongdoing only if it could be packaged inside the spectacle they wanted, which told me everything I needed to know. That same evening, as if fate itself were nudging me toward clarity, I received a separate note from the estate lawyer. It was brief, almost an afterthought, pointing out that Ray's trust contained optional philanthropic clauses, suggesting that I might consider setting up a small foundation in his name to fund scholarships or grants. I read it twice, let the words sink in, and realized how poetic it was that while my parents were begging me to stage a fake public healing to boost their image, I had the chance to build something real in Ray's memory. Something that would honor the man who had quietly believed in me when my own family couldn't. I closed my laptop, looked at Adam, and said, "They're about to learn what conditions really mean." And with that, the next phase of the plan began taking shape, one measured step at a time, guided by the one thing I had finally decided I owed myself, the refusal to let them dictate the story anymore. When the emails from my parents shifted from syrupy persuasion to passive-aggressive guilt, I realized that what they wanted was not reconciliation, not understanding, not even forgiveness, but rather a staged performance in which they could stand at the center of a spotlight they had never earned, while I, as usual, played the supporting role who smiled quietly and went along with the script. And it was in that exact realization that I decided if they were asking for a do-over wedding then. It was going to be conducted under my terms, written down clearly, enforced strictly, and structured in such a way that no matter how they tried to twist it, the truth would hold. So I sat down one evening with Adam, spread out my notes, opened the do-over energy folder, and began to write what looked less like a family plan and more like a legal agreement, because I had finally understood that with them, nothing spoken, hinted, or implied would ever hold unless it was nailed down in writing. The first condition was the simplest yet the most essential. They had to issue a public apology for walking out of my vows, not mumbled in private, not whispered over the phone, but posted in the same spaces where they had celebrated Megan's announcement. Because if they had no problem using social media to reframe my wedding as her baby shower, then they could certainly use the same platforms to admit that they had abandoned their daughter at the most important moment of her life. The second condition was non-negotiable. Megan would not give a speech, not a toast, not a word on a microphone, because I was not going to risk another hijacking disguised as a heartfelt blessing. The third condition was about money. Every single expense for the do-over would fall on Adam and me, not because we wanted the burden, but because we wanted to make sure they had no illusion of leverage, no claim later that they had paid for the spectacle and therefore had a right to control it. The fourth and final condition was the one I knew they would hate the most. Before any ceremony could take place, they had to attend a short series of counseling sessions with a licensed family therapist, proof of attendance delivered directly to me. Not because I believed therapy would magically undo years of favoritism and manipulation, but because I wanted them to face a professional who would force them, even briefly, to sit with the reality of their choices. As I wrote those terms, I felt something unusual, something I had rarely felt in relation to my family: control. For the first time, the power was not in their hands to decide what story would be told. It was in mine, laid out in clear bullet points that removed ambiguity. And, because I had learned never to put all my weight on one fragile plan, I built a backup, a city hall ceremony with only our closest friends, small, private, and live-streamed to a secure link. So that if my parents refused my conditions or tried to sabotage the process, Adam and I would still have a clean, simple vow renewal that belonged only to us. Meanwhile, Megan caught wind of my terms through my mother, and she erupted in our group chat with a rant so long it could have been mistaken for a manifesto, accusing me of trying to erase her, of punishing her for being excited about motherhood, of acting like money had turned me into some kind of tyrant, and while I could have responded with a paragraph about boundaries, I simply archived the thread, screenshotted her words, and filed them neatly into the folder, because the more evidence I had of her self-centeredness, the less explaining I would ever have to do. It was during that week that I returned to Uncle Ray's trust documents and reread the section about philanthropy. The lawyer's note about optional clauses had stuck with me, and as I skimmed the details, I realized I had the perfect opportunity to turn my inheritance into more than a shield against family politics. I could build something that honored him and simultaneously cut off the oxygen supply to the narrative my parents were trying to inflate. If they wanted to attach themselves to me for the sake of looking important, then I would attach myself to something bigger than all of us, a grant in Ray's name. One designed to fund first-generation college students who were on the edge of dropping out because of a single financial barrier. The inaugural announcement, I decided, would take place not at a press conference, not in a boardroom, but at whichever version of my do-over Vows actually happened, which meant that the spotlight they were so desperate to reclaim would no longer be about them, but about legacy, education, and a man who had believed in me when no one else had. And just because I had learned to think 3 moves ahead, I quietly executed another step, one that was entirely legal, entirely clean, and entirely boring on paper, but sharp in its effect. Through a simple public process, I purchased a small tax lien that had been placed on my parents' beloved lake cabin, the one they used as their refuge and bragging piece, because apparently in their obsession with appearances, they had neglected to pay certain fees. Once I owned the lien, I drafted a straightforward release option that tied its cancellation directly to one of my do-over terms: completion of those 4 counseling sessions. No interest, no added fees, no public humiliation, just a private document that forced them to make a choice: either confront the reality of their behavior or risk losing the one property they valued almost as much as their image. When all the pieces were in place, I sent them one final message: an invitation to our City Hall ceremony scheduled for Friday at noon, with 2 reserved seats waiting for them, and a simple line at the bottom that read, "The apology must be posted by Wednesday." The clock was ticking, the terms were clear, and for once, the balance of power was no longer theirs to twist. By Wednesday night, there was still no apology, no acknowledgement, no compliance, and instead of contrition, Megan posted a thinly veiled dig on her social feed that read, "Some people only forgive when they get a check." As though my inheritance had rewritten history rather than their choices. But the certified letter confirming delivery of the lien notice arrived the same evening, and I knew then that silence on their end was not victory, it was panic dressed as pride, and soon enough, panic always shows its cracks. Friday arrived with the kind of quiet finality that settles not because the world has gone still, but because inside yourself you know a decision has been made that will not be reversed, and as Adam and I stood in the hallway of City Hall, holding hands and waiting for the clerk to call us in, I felt the kind of calm that comes only when every condition, every move, and every piece of evidence has been stacked neatly into place, ready to shield you from whatever storm others might try to bring. Our closest friends were already seated, the live stream link was running quietly in the background, and I knew that whether my parents showed up or not, this ceremony belonged to me in a way that my first wedding day never fully did. 10 minutes before noon, my phone buzzed with an email alert, and when I opened it, there it was, a public apology posted on my parents' social page, short and flat in tone, perhaps crafted through clenched teeth, but unambiguous all the same. It read, "We regret leaving Lauren's vows on her wedding day and want to acknowledge that it caused pain. We are committed to making it right." There was no fanfare, no excuses, no performative flourish, and while I knew it had cost them dearly to admit even that much, I also knew it had cost me years of silence to finally get them here, and in that balance, I no longer felt like the one who had lost. Moments later, Carol and Dennis appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless, carrying that strained look of people who are both embarrassed and defensive, and without exchanging many words, they took their seats in the two empty chairs Adam and I had left for them. I gave them a single nod, not forgiveness, not warmth, but acknowledgement that they had at least met the minimum standard of respect I had demanded, and then I turned my full attention to the clerk who began the ceremony. For the first time, I spoke my vows without the shadow of anyone's exit hanging over me, without the tension of wondering if the people who were supposed to stay would disappear. The live stream caught the entire moment, simple and unembellished, and when Adam and I exchanged rings once more, I felt an unexpected release, not because my parents were present, but because they were irrelevant. At the small reception afterward, held in a modest hall adjacent to the chamber, I stood to give a toast, not long, not theatrical, but direct. I said, "Here's what happens in the first 24 hours when you choose truth over denial." And then I announced the launch of the Raymond Cole Grant, funded through the inheritance my godfather had left me, aimed at supporting first-generation college students on the brink of dropping out because of costs that had nothing to do with talent or drive. The applause that followed was genuine, not staged, because everyone in that room understood the difference between spectacle and sincerity, and for once I felt the kind of spotlight that does not burn, because it was mine to turn outward toward something bigger than family drama. Predictably, Megan made a scene, storming out mid-toast with a muttered complaint about how everything I did was about optics and money, as though she had not hijacked my first reception with an announcement that was nothing but optics. And while in the past I might have chased her down or tried to smooth things over, this time I let her walk without hesitation. My focus was not on keeping the family illusion intact, but on building something lasting, and as I returned to my seat with Adam beside me, I knew I had chosen the only battle worth fighting. Later that afternoon, after the guests had gone and the hall had been cleared, I handed my parents a simple envelope containing the release form for the tax lien on their lake cabin. I told them plainly that the lien would be cleared once I received confirmation of 4 completed counseling sessions, not as a punishment, but as a guarantee that if they wanted to keep that cabin, they would need to sit in a room with a professional and face the truth they had spent decades avoiding. There was no shouting, no bargaining, just the quiet sound of pens scratching as they signed the agreement, because for once, their choices carried consequences they could not sidestep. A month later, when Megan held her do-over shower in a rented hall filled with pastel balloons and staged laughter, not a single one of my friends or Adam's colleagues attended, and the absence was louder than any confrontation could have been. On the very same weekend, the foundation released its first grant to a young nurse who had been on the verge of dropping out of school over a single unpaid fee, and the local press picked up the story, framing it as a moment of community support. When they quoted my parents' earlier apology as part of the backdrop, they were painted not as the stars of a glamorous wedding redo, but as parents who had once faltered and chosen to own it, and while I knew that must have stung, it was the only gift of grace I was willing to give them. What remained in the end was not a dress, not flowers, not the illusion of a perfect family photo, but a stamped marriage certificate, a released lien, a grant bearing my godfather's name, and a clear understanding that I no longer had to beg for a seat at a table that was never built for me. And as I sat one evening, looking back over the folder I had built, I realized that every screenshot, Every email, every recording, and every condition had led to this single truth. I had turned the story on its head, not by screaming louder, but by refusing to be silenced. Do you know your true worth? It is not measured by applause at a reception or the approval of parents who only show up when money is on the line. It is measured by what you are willing to walk away from, and I finally walked away from the version of family that demanded my silence as the price of belonging. In that choice, I won, not just once, but forever.